Now, I did back in that last clip promise you two different examples for the use of Kerberos constrained delegation, and I sort of purposely didn't include the second one here because in order for a service account to be trusted for delegation, that service account needs to have what is called an SPN, or a Service Principal Name, that exists here globally in your Active Directory domain. Let's assume here that our SRV account is another of the accounts, a service account that we want to provide access to some resource. Notice here that if I attempt to launch the Our SRV account properties screen, that there actually is no delegation tab that exists here. That's because we haven't configured a service principal name yet for this account. Now, what is a service principal name? What is an SPN? SPNs, as I mentioned in the introduction to this module, are a mechanism to provide access to a specific instance of a service on a machine. A very common use of this is when you've got applications, web applications that are existing on a web server somewhere. These SPNs provide a mechanism for different services to be able to find each other inside your domain. So let's say, for example, that you had a web service, one that's running on HTTP or HTTPS on a server file 1. For that web application, you've got an IIS application pool that you've created on that server. You just need to set up the SPN to facilitate that authentication. The command you need to use is set SPN, and then the -a command. Let's assume, for example, that our app is called app1, and it exists on that server file 1. This web application, whether it's HTTP or HTTPS, will use the HTTP designator. For our application, let's call it app1.company.pri. We will then need to configure the SPN to point to file 1. What this will do is configure this here in Active Directory so that we now can actually use that as a point of authentication. Now, this configures that SPN on file 1 for the application that we've created, app1. But in some cases, you may need to configure it not to a server, but instead to a service account. You can accomplish that also with the SPN command as well. Let's say we have another web application called app2. For that, I would enter set SPN/s and then again HTTP. Again, whether that's HTTP or HTTPS, the application, we're still using the HTTP service class here. I'll direct that to app2.company.pri, and instead of pointing it to, again, that server, let's instead direct it to our service account, which would be company/our SRVACCT. This will configure the SPN now for the application app2. Once we've now registered that SPN here for our application app2, we can now further constrain down what we want that service account to be able to do by configuring Kerberos delegation. This is now the second of the two examples I promised you back in that last clip. Let me hit the F5 button here so that I can refresh the screen and then open up again our SRV account, the property screen associated. Where here again you can see the delegation tab and the fact that we can now trust this user for delegation to specified services. It's at this point where I may enter in the computers or other users and the services on those computers where I want to trust this user for delegation. Now, in most circumstances, you won't find yourself adjusting these except if you're told to by an application vendor. One such example, as I mentioned before, is anytime you're dealing with Hyper-V live migration. Configuring the appropriate permissions requires configuring constrained delegation. Same holds true if you're trying to install a VMM server that sits over the top of your Hyper-V hosts. For the purposes of the 411, I think what's most important is to understand where you would accomplish these tasks more so than why, so that you know when you're told that you need to configure constrained delegation, you'll know where to accomplish it here in Active Directory users and computers.